Yeah, so we're talking about Nietzsche and
Yeah.
his influence on you, and the primary thing, the primary impact he had was asking yourself the question of eternal recurrence. Would I want to
Yeah, it was
read?
some of the more relevant things I thought about due to him.
And the questions, you said he made you
Yeah.
ask more questions about morality.
Yeah, or at least the way that morality is thought of and not taking certain assumptions for granted.
Right. And then what about Aristotle? How is he? You said you like his way of thinking. Do you think there's been any direct impact on either the way you approach things, whether that's reading or anything else because of him?
I think just being systematic, I don't know if that's due to him, but he's always a good example of thinking based on my own thinking style that I can often cite him for something, making a distinction as a good starting point. That's a habit I've grown into sometimes, just looking at what Aristotle said on some topic if I'm beginning research on it or beginning thinking about it. It's just the way he frames things. I've
Right.
realized I found an effective way to frame science issues, especially. I found that very useful as a starting
Okay.
point. And
Right.
I've used that as a thinking habit almost.
Right.
That when he says something, it's at least establishing the groundwork of how to think about something. And other philosophers that may have been influenced by him.
Right. Would you say uh, he's a good pill for rationalism?
Like rational thought, you mean, in
No.
general? Or,
Reading Aristotle is a good antidote to someone who
right.
thinks too abstractly without thinking of the concretes.
Depends.
Yeah.
Which depends which book. You could get very rationalistic if you went into topic like certain epistemological topics, depending on when he wrote certain topics or
Right.
certain books.
Right.
I mean, like I know physics was written later than a lot of the other ones, so that was more grounded in empirical thought than say, I think, which book am I thinking of? Maybe then the book Topics. I think I'm not sure which, but it
Yeah.
is a different progression than certain works are more grounded on empirical thought than others.
Right. Okay. And we spoke about politics last session and how that's affected you as far as like day to day. What maybe there's some examples from this, but what are some examples for you of abstractions in the concrete, being able to see abstractions, so principles in the concretes? Like because I'm trying to practice more of that. So I'm curious, like day to day, what are some examples you can think of seeing, or just, I don't know, even recent examples of seeing abstractions in a concrete, in like some event or thing that doesn't have the abstraction given to you, the principle given to you?
Trying to think of an example when I would concretize a principle of politics. Um,
Could be it could be ethics as well. It doesn't, or epistemology even. I don't know if I'd ever see it. Maybe I could see an epistemological principle in a concrete. Um,
um,
okay. An epistemological principle in the concrete for me that I can think of just now would be if I write down too many things that I need to do and then I overwhelm myself by trying to think of all of them at once, that's overloading the crow. That, in a sense, that's seeing a principle in the concrete, right?
yeah, I think that is. I mean, I'm not sure what I would call that if you completely concretize it, because it's not like there's a single object out there that it refers to, but more like a set of observations. So it's harder to concretize that. It's more like you've found a concrete application of an idea, which is maybe a better way to phrase it. That like that is a concrete application of a abstract principle.
Yeah,
So
that's what
maybe
I'm looking. It
abs,
doesn't have to be a single
yeah,
concrete, because then you could say,
yeah,
if you see a cup, you're seeing the abstraction in the
yeah,
concrete. But an event can be included.
yeah. I'm thinking of, well, with politics, it's harder. I can think of, say, usually only in the news can I even think of that. Usually, say if I'm thinking about something in issues in Hong Kong, for example, I mean, those are concrete applications of the way a certain totalitarian sort of government can impact the people that live in a society in a concrete way, not just saying,
Right.
oh, it's bad, but actually observing what occurs.
Right.
Usually just news related events are what I can concretize. In my own life, it's harder because I don't have many examples of some political principle going wrong. I mean, usually it's news items that not things nearby, but I don't know, in the other side of the country or something. Those are things I've seen. Whether it's like, or his history especially. Like I can concretize things like looking at, say, causes of the Civil War. I can think in that political terms, and that's concretizing some principle I have already, or looking at um, causes of World War II. I mean, that's a way of concretizing, a way that makes it more applicable to my own thinking, because I like to see the way society became the way it is, and like what sort of world I'm living in. That's how I apply it usually.
Right. So, yeah, if I see things on the TV, like as far as news goes, political events, I don't often, I would say that actually in the lecture series by Barbara Brandon, The Art of Thinking, she does give an example of thinking in principles when Rourke has this meeting with the dean, and the dean, he's like, there's something behind this. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to file it away. So he calls it the principle behind the dean. So she gives that as an example. And she says that most people are very superficial, and they don't see that they think superficially, and they don't actually see the principle in the concrete. They would conclude something like, oh, he's just a stuffy old conservative, which is kind of like, I think how I view a lot of political events is that I don't have that those in-depth abstractions to go. I would just be, okay, Chinese government is a dictatorship, therefore they will do bad things. But that's the same equivalent of, the person who meets the dean and says he's a stuffy old conservative. So I can see the value in it. What would be an example of an abstraction or principle you've seen in recent events in Hong Kong that you think is?
Well, freedom of speech is usually the first thing I think of as a concretization of a particular kind of political principle. I mean, I can see that as,
Okay.
I mean, I might not be analyzing it, but I can file it away. Oh, yeah, that's an example of conflicts over freedom of speech. Like you're supposedly not allowed to make certain, like you shouldn't claim that Hong Kong should be free. Like you'll be thrown in jail and even killed. I mean, things like that. I mean, I don't need a deep analysis, but it's filed away in that way. Or I could look about an issue about, say, abortion rights. I can think about, what is that about? Is it just like, oh, I don't like what they say, or is it really something more fundamental that I'm disagreeing about? Like it'd be the nature of what a human life is. And that's a fundamental question. Things like that.
Can you think of any from Neuromancer? Like was there an abstraction in the concrete?
Abstraction in the concrete.
Because I'm reading a book called Shantaram right now, and I can't, like, it's not that easy to see like recognize what principles are driving behavior, or what principles are represented in certain events in the book. Like it's just very, very difficult to do it. I can see how it's valuable if you can go, oh, okay, this is a series of events related to freedom of speech, and you file away all these separate arrests into one concept. But even getting to the point where you see that is hard. But so can you, I'm reading Shantaram, I'm struggling to find principles in the concretes, but could you give me some examples of, or like one example of seeing a principle in the concrete in Neuromancer?
Well, Neuromancer is more, I can get ethical aspects of a person, or ethical principles more so. It's not very politically oriented much in the book, but as far as ethics, you could see like the main character is kind of depressed in a way, and he doesn't have any particular goal. And you could see maybe the nature of what you view life as. Like if you're depressed, and as far as politics, you can see how the world around him has created a certain psychological condition for him. Like it had to do with war around the environment that he used to be a soldier, and he was, I think, kidnapped once and tortured, and or he did something illegal at one point too. Like it's something to do with hacking other computers. And it seemed to do with like the world he lived in kind of made it necessary for him to do that, to be a criminal. And there wasn't really freedom as much as oligarchy everywhere. It's just a money-oriented society, not really capitalistic, because even the corporations would abuse rights. So it's looking at things like that, even like looking at the relationship between your psychological state and politics. It's not really direct, but you can see there's a relationship between the world you live in and the psychology you hold, and the depression he had, and even how he overcame that to some degree.
Oh, okay.
It might be
Actually, you're
say,
making me want to read that book. It sounds like
yeah,
it's a suitable book for me right now. Okay,
maybe a
cool.
primacy of consciousness analysis, because a lot of it's about cyberspace, and maybe to what extent that this other alternate reality is maybe preferable to existence, and aspects like that even.
Right. And then what so it sounds like one ethical principle might have to do with purpose, but I don't know
Yeah,
what though. What would be the principle or the abstraction?
in a way, what finding a purpose is how he changed his life condition, that
Oh,
he
the
wasn't
need
just being
for
a depressed addict anymore.
okay.
Like he's just wanting to get by. He didn't really care.
All right. I think that's enough.
It's
I'm
kind of
trying
a
to
detective story though. So it's got some of that too. Just being a cool film noir feel.
write it down. Um, yeah, I'm trying to practice looking for abstractions in everything now. That's why I wanted to pick your brain on that and compare examples of from
Yes.
my own life to yours. AI and machine learning. I remember did you work a little bit on machine learning? I don't know if they're separate or the same, but machine
They're
I've heard them both.
essentially the same. They're
Yeah, okay.
closely tied. They're not the same, but they're closely tied together.
But how have you found the relationship between studying one of them uh, and objectivist epistemology or philosophy in general? Like even Nietzsche, like I don't know how the hell Nietzsche would relate to that, but have you found a connection between philosophy, Aristotle, Nietzsche, and objectivist epistemology and machine learning?
Well, maybe not at machine learning specifically to start, but computer science, yes. A lot of the way computer science works is related to the way objectivism's epistemology works, or at least in the way it's constructed, where there's like you
Right,
have a class of objects and hierarchies of objects, and they can inherit from each other, and the
right,
way variables work, and you instantiate objects, and you also declare objects to say what characteristics they hold. You
right.
can say which characteristics must be defined and which can be undefined, things like that, a lot of different aspects that you would find in objectivist epistemology, like finding
Isn't
the
that
class and essential and things like that.
aren't those Aristotelian concepts, and the objectivist epistemology edition is the principle of measurement omission? Because I remember your paper that you sent me by Kvasnik
Yeah,
writing about this process of organizing, representing knowledge with hierarchies of species and differentia as Aristotelian, including the properties of inheritance and other properties I can't remember. So that it sounds like that, from what I understand, that is Aristotle, not Rand. Rand simply added measurement omission.
um
Would you say that's so? Then all of this, even from I can see how, because I know about object oriented programming, so I can see
yeah,
how that would
that's
be related. But would you say it's Aristotelian, whereas Rand
at
that
least
was
that, but I'd have to read some additional into object-oriented programming, like what's actually different from Aristotle, but it just all integrated with that
Yeah.
that Randian way of thinking. Even you have measurement of mission in the
Right.
would seem like part of it, because you're not necessarily getting rid of all the characteristics of a class when you get the more broader thing. It's just altering the way it's stated even, and there's a lot to it that seems like there's a lot of close ties to it. Just a way of, yeah, machine learning is more what the Aristotelian thing is, because that's mostly a matter of trying to divide categories of things, or divide things into categories by some standard or some division of measurements.
Okay. Skeptical patterns of thinking. I remember we discussed a few terms and you mentioned Hume. What would you say are some day-to-day examples of skeptical patterns of thinking? Do you think one would be the constant need to find never-ending explanations? So why, but why? Like, why did he choose it? Oh, and then you give a reason, but why did he choose that? And you just go on infinitely. Is that a skeptical pattern of thinking?
I would say it's more a matter of really what's motivating that question. Yeah, that could be a good question even. I think sometimes it can be if you're trying to get at a different level of abstraction, it might be relevant to do that.
Right.
But if your motivation is that you really don't know and you really aren't unsure about all these questions, that each level you think you can't know anyway, I think that would be a skeptical pattern, or that you're trying to suggest that there is no answer of certainty. It's just approximations always. You can never get a certain answer. I mean, that would seem like a level of skepticism that you're not even confident in your own knowledge and your own thinking.
Right.
It's almost more than skepticism in a way. I see it as more like it's just complete uncertainty at a level that you're not able to get knowledge, rather than just, it might be too skeptical, just ask too many questions, but it would be less bad if you kind of get that you're supposed to get ask relevant questions, not to ask, simply to ask. I think it would be skeptical pattern of thinking to not really see any grounding to the questions.
What do you mean by not see any grounding to the questions?
Like not having a context set of the purpose of your questions, like asking for the sake of asking, rather than asking because you're trying to attain some certain understanding about reality for a particular goal, for example. I think that's just being skeptical for its own sake. It's not really value oriented. That's what I'm saying.
Interesting. Okay. I think I do that sometimes when I well, I don't know. My questions are motivated. A lot of them, yeah, maybe they're not motivated by direct knowledge of some direct practical application once the answer is received. But I tend to think that if I ask a lot of questions, even if it's not obvious how they help me on some specific topic, if I ask a lot of questions, I get clearer on something which I can then use. That clarity is what I can then use to apply the concept. So when I ask like a million questions on epistemology, it's like a shotgun scattershot approach of trying to understand something in the hope that if I ask all these things I don't know, then I will start to get a clearer picture of the concept, which I can then use to apply to actual practical things. So I don't know if that counts as skeptical thinking, but
I'm not sure, probably
it
not.
might end up following a skeptical pattern. But I like you pointed out, motivation is important. So I don't know, but
or at least you get more efficient at asking questions as you get better able to apply some value to it. I think exploring concepts is a valid way, basis to ask questions. that there's an area of thinking to explore and think about, and asking
Yeah.
questions is just to explore that domain of thinking, to explore that field. And it's not really complete skepticism. It's like, I don't know what we called what was the term we used as the opposite of focus? Like
Diffuse.
diffuse thinking, in a way that you're trying to get a big picture grab, a big picture hold on the field, and then trying to, that'd be goal oriented, because you know why you're asking questions. It's not just for its own sake, but there's a reason behind it that is getting at something. Or it's like cleaning up your concepts, making things clearer to answer your own questions more effectively. I mean, that would seem fine.
To use a metaphor, if all questions reduce to a what is it and reduce to identification, then by asking a lot of questions that are related to the concept or the problem or the idea or whatever it is, then it's like shining a torch and getting a clearer picture of the concept. That's how I see it. And in the hopes that you can then get the concept. Although it's tricky with this idea of all knowledge is interrelated. That you can have a concept in infinite depth, which I don't really get, but that's my approach, which is this shotgun approach. I don't think that's skeptical, but.
Well, maybe I can think of it as this kind of metaphor that you're in a dark labyrinth. You can't see anything, and each question is a torch. That you first question, you light up one torch. It clarifies one concept in one way that you identify a concept. Another question is in another torch in that same room.
Yeah.
And it's a different concept. And by asking that question, you identify another concept, and it gets brighter in there. And you can say, if you light up all the torches in the room, which could be the whole field of thought, then say if you ask every question about, say, the principle of honesty, the more questions you ask, the more it gets lit up in there. But you don't want to aimlessly just light every torch.
Right.
You want to have some, start with one nearby and see what does that attach to, or what can you see nearby.
Right.
Don't just throw things away randomly. And why are you even in that labyrinth? Maybe you need to explore a certain way that you just don't want to, maybe you don't want to see everything, but you're trying to get to a certain point. So that's another way to guide the way you're revealing everything.
Right. So there's the implicit principle of purpose is in that. To take that further would be, I'm in a room. I first try and light up the room rather than light up there's like, I send a light into one corner and there's a jug. And instead of asking a million questions about the jug, it's important to light up the rest of the room to the same brightness. And then I can start focusing in on things depending on my purpose, but to not narrow in on one specific thing, which is, it's easier when you put it in metaphor like that, it's easy, but in reality, when you're studying some abstract topic, it's not easy. Have you gone through The Art of Thinking?
Not in a while, but yes.
Yeah, okay.
I don't remember much of it, but I did it a long time ago.
Okay. Yeah, because the first lecture talks about volition as a means to clarity and suppressing questions, which I'm still not fully clear on, like when I would need to suppress a question, when not. He's like, if you've got too many questions, you just keep studying. But that's, I don't, that's what I have, too many questions. But I'm in a group that's reviewing that anyway. So
yeah.
All right, I want to ask you about hypotheticals and statistics. So, like people, you can often ask, what if this happens, or what if that happens? And people ask different what ifs. Like some people, I'm definitely a more cynical, negative person in some respects, not always, but in some respects. And so my what ifs may be weighted more towards bad things that can happen. Like, what if this, what if that? And so what ifs are just, I'm just trying to get underneath what is a hypothetical. Like it's a form of imagination, right? And that imagination is based on evidence that you're weighting and granting importance. So it's like based on your sense of life, based on your implicit philosophy, there are certain things. Well, I actually don't know if it's philosophy that determines what is and isn't important, but we'll just go with sense of life, which is broader and more vague for me. But based on your sense of life, different things in the world, everything is kind of like evidence of something that could happen to you. Meaning, if you see someone suffering, you're like, that's evidence that it could happen to you. But the way you weight it is determined by your sense of life. So it's like your brain is like this statistical machine, and it's weighing things and granting them different levels of importance based on your sense of life. Would you say that's a correct conceptualization of the process of describing what and how the kinds of hypotheticals people entertain is determined?
No, because I think hypotheticals are usually just better framed as well, it depends the context of how it's being used. Hypothetical, I guess, could mean entertaining what or thinking about what could occur. Hypothetical. Usually I think of those as thought experiments, that they're just, if this occurred, what would you do? Whether it's plausible is a different kind of question. Like, are you trying to ask about, say, planning the future for what might happen? I mean, are you thinking about what's, like, for example, is hypothetical, like what could happen if you, I don't know, move to Italy for some reason? Like, would that be hypothetical? Like, what could happen to you? And that's a different kind of hypothetical.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, what's the difference then? What do you mean that's a different
Well, when
hypothetical?
I think of,
From what?
say,
Different from what?
when you think of a thought experiment, say, you know the trolley problem, right?
I've heard of it.
I mean, you're not really going to find people strapped to a train track, but I think it could be entertaining to think about, even if it's not a realistic scenario. It's a
Right.
way to get at what questions matter, or if reality were different, what would you do? Or what about reality would changes the way this decision might go down? Like, why would real life change that? Or why should real life make a different answer? That could be more for advanced topics, like once you already got the fundamentals of a topic down.
Okay.
Like, I wouldn't go and jump into hypotheticals and mere possibilities when you're just jumping into a topic, because everything is already so abstract. You don't want to take it further away from reality into imagination. Like, you wouldn't want to start talking about Lord of the Rings for your ethical principles. I mean, later on, it might be relevant to talk about that. And
Did you
an
say
interesting,
Lord of the Rings?
yes, I said Lord of the Rings.
Oh, why?
And
Okay, anyway, I'll ask you later, but yeah, go on.
you certainly could ask questions about ethics in relation to Lord of the Rings, but that's not really a starting point to talking about it. So hypotheticals are more so like, they should only be used, I think, when you already know you're changing the context, or making things artificial, to just think about certain specific principles or specific concepts. But you could have hypotheticals like more general ones, like what would happen if, um, well, what if you had a really difficult test? Why not cheat on it? You can call that hypothetical. Like, you're taking a test next week. You could cheat on it. Imagine you did. What would happen? Or you could say, suppose you cheated on the test next week. What do you suppose might happen as a result? I mean, that would be a hypothetical, but it's applied directly to what's supposed to be real life. You're trying to see what would in fact occur in real life, not just a what if, but like, it really is an option for you to take. And you could think about, if I took that option, what could I foresee happening? And that's just future thinking, like trying to foresee the future, like use your, think into the future about what to expect or what to plan for, or why should you even act with honesty in mind. This long-term thinking, how are you able to do that?
Okay, so basically from what I got, I was writing down a couple of things. So you're saying you view hypotheticals as serving two different purposes. So one is to real life imaginary scenarios to plan out what you might do if something occurs
Yeah.
and how that would play out and so on. And the next one is philosophical, which hypotheticals to try and understand some concept by creating an imaginary scenario and seeing how a certain principle would play out. Am I correct in saying that that's how you view hypotheticals, as those two uses?
Yeah, or you could even the more imaginary hypothetical would be like if reality were different, what kind of implications would that have? And even by comparison, you could say, oh, reality isn't that way. So what would be different? Or even since you're abstracting away some concretes about it, like you can abstract away specifically um, the test you're going to take and just think about honesty in general. You could think of honesty more abstractly, like honesty on another planet, honesty on in Middle Earth. What would be different, or why would it be different if it were different? Or if it is the same, what kind of decisions would you make in such a situation? It's more abstract and more like the rule of art, taking that abstraction and concretizing it. But there could be more narrow things, like specifically like with Borges, sometimes it feels like it's just a puzzle, not really art. It's just like, here's a context to think about it. That's not really realistic, but it's fine if you're already well aware of the abstraction you're dealing with, but not good if you're a beginner.
Just looking up etymology of hypothetical. Because hypo is below. Yeah, hypo is below, underneath, or
Yes.
less. So because you mentioned abstracting away, so taking away certain elements of reality and leaving fewer of them to think about. So that makes sense. A hypothetical, less than whatever thetical is. I don't know, but
Thesis is, I think,
Sorry?
idea. I think
Okay.
thesis.
Oh.
So hypothesis.
All right, but I would still say that does sound like that there's those two
Base.
categories. So real life, imaginary scenarios, and then
Oh,
philosophical.
is a base, a supposition, and placing under. That's what it
Yeah,
means literally, to place under.
but there's when they, it's also, let's have a look. There's all these diseases.
Hypothesis is a Latin word. So
Is a what?
it is a Latin word. Just
A lion?
hypothesis. No, hypothesis
Is a what?
is a Latin word spelled the same way.
Oh. But if
It is
you
Latin.
look at, it's also slower than or less than, because I'm looking all the hypo diseases like hypothalamic dysfunction, hypothermia, you're not warm enough. So it's like you're maybe removing some element of reality. But it still seems like, given the examples you gave, you're dividing them into two categories, so real life and then philosophical.
Or abstract, I would say.
Yeah,
I like to say
abstract.
imaginary. Imaginary might be better. But
Okay,
sure,
but the
works too.
real life one is also imaginary. It's just
True.
For personal use.
It's future-oriented thinking rather than alternative reality.
Okay, all right. Future orientated rather than alternative reality. And why did you mention Lord of the Rings? Is that because you were saying you could think of that as an imaginary hypothetical in which to consider certain philosophical ideas?
Yeah, it's more like a random association that hit me because I've thought about it before in the past. So it came to mind because I watched it like last year, all three of them again, and it's kind of fresh in my mind about this certain ethical principle. What do you mean?
Why is that not a good starting point for?
Well, I just mean if you're not, well, I guess it depends. It's hard to say.
Okay.
I'm trying to think, is there a reason? I mean, It depends. If you don't want to, the reason I'm unsure is because I don't want to get someone thinking about just rationalizing everything, having floating abstractions. Because if you're abstracting only from Lord of the Rings, it would be a bit too abstract because you're not abstracting from reality. But then again, like we've talked about art before, it has a function, so it actually might be helpful.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. And so going to the future, thinking about hypotheticals in terms of future orientated thinking, you mentioned the test, like if the test is difficult, what will I do? But that's one example. So, you don't think, what if the test is written in Khmer? Is that how you say it? I don't know
I think so.
yeah. What if the test is written as Khmer? What will I do? That doesn't occur to you because you're like, there's no evidence for that. And it's not within the
Yeah.
realm of alternatives that you conceptualize, right? Like it's an unknown.
Yeah.
But what leads someone to, if we're talking about people who create hypotheticals, I mean, you could consciously drive a hypothetical.
Yeah.
And you could also, there's also emotional hypotheticals where they're
Yeah.
like, what if this and this happens? What if that happens? What if
Yeah.
whatever? And they can be driven by, this is what I said at the start, where I was like, is that when they're driven by emotion, are they sense of life driven, in that what you're like, everything in a sense is like, I don't know if to say everything is possible is correct, but a lot of things are possible and within the realm of possibility, but not all of them should be granted importance if with a rational
Right.
philosophy, right? And
Right.
so would it be correct to say that hypotheticals that people entertain when they're not consciously, well, even consciously driven to some extent, but when they're emotionally driven, primarily, they reflect a sense of life, and the sense of life is granting different levels of importance to different things based on emotional associations. So the importance could be considered the weight that the evidence has.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
I would only modify that to say that it's also important to remember the reason it's occurring. Like if it's like a reaction to an impending test, that's one thing. But if your goal is just, well, it depends what your goal is. If you're trying to evaluate the best course of action when taking a test, then I would call it almost paranoid to worry that, like, oh, what if it's in another language that I don't even speak? Like, there's almost no basis to think that. And based on just trying to think about, we're just trying to think about how to prepare for the test, that's not really rational, and it might be driven by maybe I'm not even sure what would drive somebody to think something so off base, but it's almost like a disorder, even like
It's
an extreme
emotional.
OCD.
Well,
Yeah,
I
there's
think
some
it would
disorder
just
even.
be emotional association. Like there's two modes of, we talked about, I think I talked about this with you a while back, or I've talked about it with someone else, but I've definitely have spoken about it with you as well. In the mind is an integrative mechanism, and it can either be automatic or conscious. The automatic is
Yes.
emotional associations. And so emotional associations, not necessarily being
Yeah.
logical, means that you can come up, if you're used to operating that way, you can come up with fairly arbitrary hypotheticals. So like, what if the test is written in Arabic when there's
Yeah.
no evidence for it?
I think part of it could be sense of life, but also thinking of how even people who get those maybe what ifs that appear out of nowhere, they might suddenly even recognize that it is irrational and it is stupid. Like in any sense of it, it's just there's no rational basis to think it, but it pops in their mind no matter what. I don't know if that would be a sense of life thing. It might be recognizing that you're not well integrated as far as your goals in life,
Right.
that you feel in conflict because of the uncertainty you get and the severity of the or the irrationality of it might refer to to what degree your integration is difficult in life. Or it might be a more just explicit emotional thing that nothing seems causal in your life. Everything feels random. It won't. Then yeah, everything would probably feel anxiety inducing because you don't really know what could happen. And those what ifs, don't know what if seems more or less implausible than another. And that's one way that could occur.
So the reason I was thinking about this, I was thinking about there's room to write about this topic, which is almost, I would call it the philosophy of hypotheticals, because I can tell you, so my friend from another city runs a business. And I remember when he's been into business for like a huge amount of time, many years, tried starting many different businesses, failed, started other ones, blah, blah, blah. Now he's quite successful in running. He's got 3 businesses. I remember when he first hired someone, he was like, his thinking behind it was like, what if I don't hire someone? The risk is so much greater if I have to do all the work myself and it won't expand. Like, yeah, the person could take everything I've done and start a new business copying mine, but what if I don't hire him? And so that kind of thinking of like his what if was completely different than someone else, right? Someone else could just focus on the risk of the person. They could go, what if the person takes all this and that? But the power is that his power was entertaining the right what if, because it clearly has worked for him long term. Like a lot of his what ifs are different in the sense that I don't want to say, well, you could describe him as an optimist, but clearly like the kind of what ifs he is asking are completely different than someone else, and actually different than me. And so that's what motivated me to think about it, because there are so many possibilities, right? Like if you think about day to day, in a sense, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know what you plan to do tomorrow, maybe, but you don't know what's going to happen. And so what you choose to focus your consciousness on in any given moment, what scenarios you entertain and plan for, does seem to matter quite a lot. But the question then becomes, for someone who wants to optimize their what ifs, what if they're based on, okay, so they're based on what's in your subconscious store. They're based on sense of life and what you consider important. But then, like that's my motivation asking this question is like, how would you then what are some ways to logically think through what ifs? Meaning, if you are presented by what ifs and your subconscious storehouse or database or whatever you want to call it presents you with these what ifs, how would you analyze them? So for example, there are many different kinds of what ifs. You could be like, what if a car runs me over tomorrow, which sounds terrible, but what if a car runs me over tomorrow? In a sense, like you could say that that's a kind of possibility. Like if you're in a certain place at a certain time, in certain conditions, or you could ask, what if tomorrow I spent all day reading? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like they're completely different things to think about, and both can occupy your time and thought. But the first one is a bit extreme. I know it's terrible, so maybe I want to get rid of that. But like, how do you, because I'm just trying to find a way to analyze these, because in a sense, this can, well, I don't even know how to think about it in terms of epistemology. Like epistemologically, you can say, well, if you are in the street, then there is a possibility of that happening. I mean, I don't know, is anything written about how you even analyze these kind of things from an epistemological perspective in order to then get to the point where you're optimizing the kind of what ifs you ask to be more realist and useful? Because obviously volition is an element in this, right? Like to ask yourself, like, what if an asteroid hits tomorrow? That's actually better than the car one. What if an asteroid hits the Earth tomorrow? Like, that might not even be a good what if, even if it's within possibility, and you're like, okay,
I feel like Peikoff asked that question once, or answered such a question once in Understanding Objectivism.
In
I had to look
understanding
up
of,
the page. Yeah, he
oh,
mentioned something about like somebody asking, what if I got hit by an asteroid when I took the other fork in the road? Something like
oh,
that.
oh, really? That's exactly what I'm looking for. How to think about, to then find a method of using epistemology to analyze hypotheticals and optimize them
I
by
think he's got
training.
some stuff about that kind of
Okay.
question.
Oh, okay.
I can't think of anything really specific what you have in mind, at least not within objectivism. I can't think of anybody.
Okay. I will ask other people. That's cool. But
But
that's
I mean, I have
basically
some
what I'm looking
answers.
for.
I have
Yeah.
some of my own answers to it,
What are they?
like say, knowing the purpose of your question, what set off the question. I mean, those are two starting things. Like, why are you even asking? Is the way to start.
But couldn't someone say because it could happen?
I would answer them like that's not specific enough. It doesn't, not gonna optimize your thinking. I mean, sure, okay, what if it did? I mean, you gotta optimize better. You gotta frame the question better. Otherwise, you're not gonna get anywhere with it.
Well, how about this one? Could aliens arrive on Earth tomorrow? And if they do, what will I do?
Yeah.
But is it epistemologically correct to say that's a possibility? Like, I don't even know how to think about these kind of questions. Like, is that arbitrary or is
It'd
that a
be
possibility?
arbitrary. But I think
Yeah.
arbitrary just, yeah, but if you know it's arbitrary, then it's just a matter of thinking, like recognizing that it's imaginary thing would be okay if you know you're doing that. But I mean, then it might just be a matter of, I don't know, are you thinking about, say, issues of communication? Like if you're trying to think about how do I communicate, how do I translate a language that's never been observed before, which has happened on Earth, as in there were ancient civilizations that there was this alphabet called Linear B, and for decades nobody could read it. Nobody knew what it said. If you wanted to translate it, and I could imagine if you ask yourself, well, what if aliens came by? How would I communicate with them? How would I communicate this, a foreign language, to somebody that might not even be able to understand what my symbols mean? They don't even know what to go on. How would you
Right.
answer them? How would you reply? And you would know that aliens landing probably would be arbitrary, but you could recognize that it in like a hypothetical, like the more imaginary things we were talking about. Like, oh, what if, how would I communicate with them? But if your reason for asking is you're worried if you should become a survivalist and hide in your basement tomorrow, well, that's a different context. Then
But
it's not optimal thinking.
that's the really interesting one. There's a short story by that's the context that interests me anyway for my own personal self-improvement, because there's some of the bizarre what ifs I ask. There's a short story by, what's his name? Let me just look it up. I think his name's Quent Cordair. He's like he has an art gallery or something.
Yes.
And he wrote a little book on shorts. He had this book of short stories that I read a while ago. And one of them was about, I think it was called The Survivor or something like that. I can't remember. Yeah. But it's about a guy who builds a bunker, like just in case a war or some kind of like there's a nuclear explosion or something. And he just gets deeper and deeper into this headspace of like planning for all these what ifs. And so it gets at that, like there's a difference between an imaginary, like you pointed out, an imaginary hypothetical in order to broaden your knowledge and challenge yourself versus arbitrarily, I don't even know if it's arbitrary, but entertaining hypotheticals in an unproductive or way that is ultimately not servicing flourishing. And there are ways to entertain, like there are ways to direct yourself to consider hypotheticals that take you towards flourishing. Like the example of my friend considering the question of, what if I don't hire someone? instead of
Yeah.
what if this person steals all these ideas I have?
Yeah.
I think that from what I am guessing, there's got to be something to do with metaphysical versus man-made, or maybe volitional and non-volitional. Like, yeah, there may be a thing that you could
Yes.
epistemologically say is a possibility, but I think maybe if it's non-volitional, you have to treat it differently. So something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know yet, but
Yeah, I would say so, because things you can't control are always treated different than things you can. I mean,
right.
obviously, if it is possible, look at hit by a car in a freak accident, it happens. I mean, but that's non-volitional. So that lowers the importance of the question. I
Right.
think that's almost unpreventable.
Right.
I mean, could prevent it by never going outside, but that's not really a rational response either.
Yeah, I think it's I don't know. It's for me, it's an interesting area because I feel like optimizing what ifs, and no matter even if you think of yourself as, no matter if you think of yourself as cynical or positive or whatever it is, but um, the optimizing what ifs seems like a powerful thing to direct your consciousness to productive things that take you towards flourishing more than detract from. But
yeah, I think so. I do that with writing sometimes. Like
what
I
do you do?
just like my stories are usually just hypotheticals, and in a way that like I want to think about them, and I transform it into a more productive end, not just in the art I'm making, but that I'm trying to come up with, finding principles within it, or what psychological principle of thought I'm getting at. Things like that. It's not just merely for its own sake, but that I'm really thinking about things. I'm thinking about life or ethics or psychology in some applied way.
Could you give me an example of one you've done
Um,
recently that you don't mind sharing, of like how the hypothetical you entertained let you achieve, or yeah, give me an example so I can see better.
let's see. Um, Trying to think of a good example. I'm thinking of a character, a story of mine, where she, thinking, oh, a different story. I was thinking about, what if you literally split your mind in two and put one brain in a vat and one brain in a robot? What would happen? And I applied that more to, what is the purpose of an integrated mind? Does it matter if we are in one body or two? Things like that. Or maybe
Oh,
even
that's
more
interesting.
or
Okay.
philosophically, what does it mean to have self-identity, to know you're an individual, rather than say thinking you're 5 different entities? Or what does it take to be one entity?
Okay. That's interesting. And then what did you learn about how you
Well,
identify yourself?
I was thinking that, well, you can't really be multiple conscious. Like there's one, maybe you could have one sense of self, that there's one guiding aspect to being an entity. And if you were split up, you would not function well. Like by nature, it would make sense that you're not like a multiply operating consciousness at once, or something like that. I'd have to show you the story when
Right.
I edit. Yeah, I should collect them together and give them to people.